Picture this. You spend an entire afternoon with your best friend, the person you call your brother. You watch him laugh, watch him meet someone new, watch the day unfold exactly the way ordinary summer days do. And then, months later, sitting across from a camera, you're asked to account for those same 90 minutes, and the story you tell doesn't hold together. That's the position Warren Hudson found himself in, not because anyone accused him of anything, because his own words, spoken less than 2 minutes apart in the same television interview, described two different versions of where his friend Nolan Wells was standing, 90 minutes apart on the clock. Nobody watching live caught it. It took a trained analyst combing back through the footage to notice. Tonight we're not starting with the interview. We're starting with the boy at the center of it, because before this became a case, a controversy, a grand jury referral, it was a life, and that matters more than any contradiction we're about to walk through. Nolan Wells was 18. On the evening of July 3rd, he made his family salmon for dinner before heading out to spend the night with friends ahead of the holiday. He hugged his mother, told her he loved her, and left through the front door the way he had 1,000 ordinary times before. Nothing about that morning suggested it would be his last. At a press conference weeks later, his mother, Christine Wansley, was asked what she wanted the public to understand about her son. She described a gentle, calming presence, someone who had a genuine gift for making other people feel noticed, welcomed, valued. What makes that description land differently than a typical grieving parent quote is how many other people, independently, described him the exact same way. His football coaches, his teachers, his best friend Javon Williams, in a separate interview with CNN, his teammates, without any of them coordinating their answers. When that many unconnected voices land on the same portrait, it stops sounding like sentiment and starts sounding like fact. Nolan was the kind of kid who remembered your name, asked how your week went, and made you feel worth talking to, even if he wasn't the loudest person in the room. That's who disappeared from Horn Island on July 4th. Everything else in this case, every autopsy, every subpoena, every online theory, exists because that ordinary young man never made it home. Strip away every detail for a second and look at the raw shape of this case. Nolan was last independently confirmed to be on Horn Island around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The boat that brought him there left without him at 4:31. Somewhere inside that 90-minute gap sits the entire unanswered question of what happened to him. And right now, nobody, not investigators, not his family, not the public, has a complete, verified account of what filled it. An independent analytical review completed on the case reached exactly that conclusion. The currently available evidence leaves a genuine, material hole in the timeline between Nolan's last confirmed sighting and the boat's departure. That's not speculation. That's the formal finding of people who've actually studied the available footage, statements, and photographs. Two accounts exist that attempt to describe what happened in that window, and they point in opposite directions. Nolan's friend Warren Hudson has said publicly that the group repeatedly asked Nolan to get back on the boat and that Nolan told them he'd catch a ride with someone else instead, something Warren describes as not unusual on Horn Island, where people frequently arrive on one boat and leave on another. On the other side, the family of Katie McCormick, the young woman Nolan spent that afternoon with, has offered a different account through her sister Gracie. According to that version, Nolan's friends were pressuring him to wrap up the conversation so he could rejoin them. Katie assumed he was heading back to the boat, and she genuinely believed his friends wouldn't leave the island without him. Neither account, by itself, proves anything sinister happened, but they can't both be fully accurate, and that disagreement alone is enough reason to look closely at everything surrounding it. Here's a detail that doesn't get discussed nearly as often as it should. Nolan's parents, Christine and Elmore Wansley, have both stated publicly that they raised him with one non-negotiable rule about group outings. You leave with the people you arrived with. His best friend Javon Williams confirmed something consistent with that independently, telling CNN that in the entire time he'd known Nolan, he had never once seen him stay behind when his group left. 3 separate people, none of them coordinating their statements, all describing the same lifelong habit. For Warren's account to be accurate, Nolan would have had to break that habit for the first and only documented time in his life. On the exact day, it may have cost him everything. To be fair, people do occasionally break their own patterns. An 18-year-old who's just met someone he's genuinely interested in might, for once, make a different call than usual. That's a real possibility, not a fantasy. But it's precisely the kind of detail a serious investigation has to weigh rather than dismiss, and it makes the "he just decided to stay" explanation carry more weight than it would if this were an isolated, one-off account with no behavioral history behind it. Now let's get to the moment that actually triggered this deeper look. An on-camera conversation between Warren Hudson and interviewer Brandon Tatum, recorded days after Nolan's body was recovered. The stated purpose was simple, and on its face, sympathetic. Give a grieving young man room to tell his side of a story that had already exploded across social media, and push back against the swirl of unverified rumors targeting him and his friends. Millions of people watched that interview. Almost none of them caught what a former U.S. Army human intelligence interrogator later flagged when reviewing the footage independently.
I am a former Army interrogator, human intelligence collector. I was trained by the United States government to analyze your language, body language, posture to identify deception. I did it in the real world through interrogations, through source operations, and through strategic debriefings. I've got tons of certifications. I'm an expert at.
Here's how he describes his own training, in his own words, before we get to what he actually found. Worth repeating clearly, this is an independent commentator offering his professional opinion, not an investigator formally attached to this case. His conclusions are analysis, not official findings. But given his specific training, spotting inconsistency in spoken testimony, his read on this footage is worth hearing in full.
There getting towed out.
Yeah.
And then where's Nolan in this situation?
Well, Nolan was, the last time I saw Nolan was 3 o'clock.
Last time he saw Nolan was 3 o'clock. That is critically important information. Right here, he's talking about when his buddy Bart pulls out his buddy Wyatt's boat. So Bart is on one boat and he's pulling out Wyatt's boat. Wyatt's boat is the one that you've heard about was taken on water and sinking, and that's why they had to leave Horn Island. I want you to pay attention to this.
To where we're out of all this, all this chaos, because we left at 4:30 and there was still.
We left at 4:30. We left at 4:30. This guy just said that the last time he saw Nolan was 3 o'clock. Very specific time. Now, how did he know it was 3 o'clock? Brandon Tatum didn't ask him that. If this was an interrogation, that's a key question I would ask. How do you know it was 3 o'clock?
And then where's Nolan in this situation?
Well, Nolan was, the last time I saw Nolan was 3 o'clock.
3 o'clock.
And Nolan was cradling a girl in his arms, Katie. Katie.
Pay attention to how specific Warren's first answer is. 3 o'clock, not sometime in the afternoon, not a while before we left. A specific hour, delivered without hesitation, attached to a specific visual. Nolan cradling Katie in his arms, laughing, shaking his head. Warren then says the line that anchors everything that follows. That was the last time I laid eyes on him. Katie McCormick has since disputed elements of how Warren characterizes that moment. That disagreement matters on its own, but the bigger problem sits just a few minutes further into the same conversation.
So it would be 4:30, because he's already said we were leaving at 4:30.
Nolan was sitting by the boat.
Nolan was sitting by the boat. How do you know, Warren, that Nolan was sitting by the boat? The last time you laid eyes on him was at 3 o'clock. It's now 4:30. This is your timeline. Timeline is everything. At this part of the story, he's at 4:30. But he just said less than a minute ago 2 minutes ago that the last time he saw Nolan was 3 o'clock.
Nolan was sitting by the boat with that Katie girl, and
How do you know that? The last time you laid eyes, your exact words, on him was 3 o'clock. You're now talking about 4:30. Now listen what happens next.
Now watch what happens when the conversation shifts to the moment the boat actually left. Nolan was sitting by the boat with that Katie girl. That's a specific claim about a specific location, 90 minutes after Warren said his direct visual contact had already ended. You don't get that level of detail secondhand. You get it by looking directly at something, which means one of these two statements, spoken barely 2 minutes apart in the same sentence-by-sentence conversation, doesn't match reality as Warren describes it.
my buddy yelled for Nolan, get on the boat or leave.
Now, in the interest of honest analysis here, if they were both on the boat and he heard his buddy yelling at Nolan, not him, by the way. Warren wasn't yelling at Nolan. Even in his own story, he wasn't looking for Nolan or yelling for Nolan. And in the beginning of part 1 of the interview, he says, Nolan was like a brother to me. He was my best friend. More than a friend, though. He was like a brother to me. But Warren's not the one looking for Nolan, not the one yelling for Nolan. He don't even go over and lay eyes on him again, according to his own story that he's telling us. But he hears his buddy saying, hey, Nolan.
The boat's having issues, and no, he didn't say that, but he was panicking. Nolan, get the F on the boat. Get on the boat. And Nolan said, no, I'm staying out here. I'm going to ride in with somebody else.
And here's the piece that makes this even harder to explain away. It wasn't Warren who called out to Nolan. By his own account, it was someone else, a different friend entirely. Warren never says he walked over, never says he checked on Nolan himself. So the question becomes unavoidable. If his information came only from hearing someone else shout across the water, how did he know exactly where Nolan was sitting and who he was sitting beside? That's the specific gap the interrogator identified as needing direct follow-up, a follow-up that never came. Here's something worth understanding about why this slipped past everyone watching live. A formal law enforcement interrogation operates on a strict discipline. The moment a subject's own account contradicts itself, the interviewer stops, circles back, and makes the subject reconcile the two versions before moving forward. That's not a stylistic choice. It's the entire mechanism by which real interviews extract truth, because contradictions, not smooth narratives, are where the actual information tends to live. This wasn't that kind of conversation, and it's important to say that plainly rather than imply otherwise. Brandon Tatum has said he had no prior relationship with Warren's family before this interview happened, and his role wasn't investigative. He was there to let a grieving friend speak publicly, on his own terms, in his own words. Those are two fundamentally different jobs with two fundamentally different goals, and holding that against Tatum personally would be unfair. But the outcome is still worth sitting with. An interview built specifically to clear a friend group's name ended up producing the single most significant unresolved discrepancy in this case's entire public record, and it passed by without anyone in the room noticing. There's a second professional opinion worth adding here, because it doesn't point in only one direction. TMZ separately brought in body language expert Susan Constantine to review this same footage. Her overall read was largely favorable toward Warren, consistent, credible demeanor through most of the conversation. It was specifically when the discussion turned to Nolan's phone that she noted a shift, hesitation, self-soothing gestures, and concluded that his denial about anyone touching the device read as deceptive. She was explicit that this doesn't mean she believes foul play occurred. It means, in her professional assessment, the phone question specifically didn't sound fully honest. And the phone, it turns out, has become a formal part of this investigation in its own right. Before we get to the phone, subscribe if you want this kind of careful, source-by-source breakdown delivered the moment new developments actually happen in this case, rather than piecing it together from scattered social media clips days after the fact. Now here's the fair counterweight to everything above, and it deserves equal space, not a token mention. Human memory under emotional stress is genuinely, scientifically unreliable. And this isn't opinion, it's established forensic psychology. People do not reliably retain precise clock times from chaotic days involving hundreds of strangers on a beach. What happens instead is compression. Separate memories blur into a single narrated moment, and that moment often comes out sounding far more specific and confident than the underlying memory actually supports. It's entirely plausible that Warren merged two genuinely separate things in his own mind. A real, specific memory of talking with Nolan around 3 o'clock, and a vaguer, second-hand impression of Nolan's general location later on, gathered from things other people said or from a quick glance he doesn't fully remember. Narrated together under the pressure of a public interview, that blend can sound like one clean, continuous memory even when it isn't. That's a documented, common feature of how people recall traumatic days, and on its own, it is not evidence of hiding anything. The competing possibility carries equal weight and deserves to be stated with the same directness. If Warren genuinely did have direct visual contact with Nolan at 4:30, close enough to know his exact position and company, then his earlier statement about 3 o'clock simply wasn't accurate, and nobody in that interview asked him to explain the gap. We're not in a position to tell you which of these is true. Nobody watching this video has enough information to make that call from a single television interview. What we can say is that this is exactly the kind of inconsistency a formal, individually conducted investigative interview exists to catch, and whether that formal process has already resolved it is something the public simply hasn't been told. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office has maintained its position that Wells voluntarily stayed behind after others left. Nolan's family and their legal representation have pushed back on that conclusion, pointing to what they describe as inconsistencies across different witness accounts. Whether Warren's account to actual investigators, assuming one has been formally taken, resolves cleanly is simply unknown to anyone outside that investigation right now. There's physical evidence underneath all of this that hasn't yet reached the public, and when it does, it's likely to confirm or seriously undercut everything discussed so far. Start with the phone. When the group came back to shore without Nolan, his phone stayed on the boat. His mother has said publicly that it seemed genuinely improbable to her that her son would have chosen to remain on an island, miles offshore, without the one device connecting him to everyone else. Once the phone made it back to her, she says she found something troubling, or more precisely, the absence of something. No saved Snapchat content from July 4th at all, despite the family accessing the device within the roughly 24-hour window before that kind of content typically expires on its own. The explanation offered by Nolan's friends is genuinely reasonable on its face. Phones commonly get left on boat dashboards to avoid saltwater damage, and cell coverage around Horn Island is famously weak, meaning content might never have synced to begin with. That's a real, plausible explanation, and it deserves to be treated as such. But weigh it against this. Nolan had just spent his afternoon getting to know someone he was clearly drawn to. Most teenagers in that exact situation want their phones specifically so they can exchange contact information before parting ways. Leaving it behind cuts against that instinct. Not proof of anything, but a detail that refuses to resolve cleanly in either direction. What happens to that phone next carries real weight regardless of which explanation turns out to be true. The device is reportedly set to undergo joint forensic examination, conducted with both the family's independent experts and official investigators watching the same extraction happen in real time. Legal analysts following the case have noted that this kind of simultaneous, both sides inspection is unusual outside cases already trending towards serious criminal proceedings, precisely because both sides only insist on watching each other when they believe what's found could genuinely change the outcome. An attorney connected to the case has confirmed discussions are ongoing about that joint review, and that FBI involvement is expected if it moves forward. As of now, results haven't been made public. The phone raises one open question. The competing autopsies raise several more, and this is where credentialed medical professionals have publicly landed in disagreement with each other over identical physical evidence. Dr. Roger Mitchell Jr., president of the National Medical Association and former chief medical examiner for Washington, D.C., conducted an independent autopsy and concluded that Nolan's cause and manner of death are undetermined. Presenting those findings publicly, he stated he could not rule out non-accidental factors as contributors to Nolan's death. Attorney Ben Crump, reading from Mitchell's report directly, summarized it in 3 words: not drowning, not homicide, undetermined. Mitchell's report contains specific details worth understanding on their own terms. He documented reddish discoloration in soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head, without a clear determination of what caused it or whether it relates to the cause of death at all. No skull fractures, no lacerations, just that discoloration, flagged by Mitchell as deserving further study. His most significant limitation, by his own account, was being unable to directly examine the airway, lungs, and stomach contents, exactly the tissue that would normally help determine whether Nolan was alive and breathing at the moment he entered the water. Without that evidence, whether Nolan went into the water conscious or unconscious remains genuinely unresolved. Then there's the detail that reportedly silenced the room when Mitchell first presented it publicly. Certain structures from Nolan's throat weren't present when his body arrived for this second examination, having been retained during the original state autopsy. As a result, Mitchell said, he couldn't rule out injury to the neck as a contributing factor. That needs immediate, careful context before it grows into something it isn't. Retaining specific tissue during a first autopsy is entirely standard forensic practice, and Mitchell said so himself. Dr. Priya Banerjee, a board-certified forensic pathologist with no connection to this case, has explained that second independent autopsies routinely face this exact limitation. Secondary examiners frequently don't have access to material already collected during the primary exam. That's simply how the process usually works. But it cuts both ways. If tissue was specifically retained because of concerns tied to neck compression, that retention itself becomes a legitimate question worth asking. Not proof of anything, just an open thread that deserves an answer. Outside experts, also unconnected to the case, have offered conflicting readings of that same discoloration. Dr. Kendall Von Crowns, chief medical examiner in Tarrant County, Texas, suggested it could reflect ordinary decompositional changes in muscle tissue, or alternatively, blunt force trauma to the head and neck. Dr. Victor Whedon, a forensic sciences professor at George Washington University, raised a third possibility entirely: lividity, the natural settling of blood after death due to gravity. Same physical finding, 3 credentialed professionals, 3 different interpretations. That disagreement stays open until complete findings from both autopsies, toxicology included, sit together in front of a grand jury. The state's own autopsy, conducted by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office, is now complete but remains sealed, along with the rest of the case's evidence, until a grand jury reviews it. Nobody outside that process currently knows what the state actually found. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter has publicly confirmed FBI involvement in reviewing digital evidence collected so far, noting that this isn't unusual given that Horn Island sits on federal land and his office regularly partners with federal agencies. He's confirmed all 3 friends who were on the boat with Nolan have been formally interviewed, alongside more than 60 total witnesses. Ben Crump has said his own legal team is running a parallel independent investigation, including forensic audio review of the complete emergency distress call from July 4th, and ocean engineering analysis examining how Nolan's body was ultimately recovered near the northwestern tip of Horn Island, roughly the same area he was last seen, 2 full days after he disappeared. That last point genuinely deserves attention. Crump has asked publicly how that's scientifically possible given the area's tidal patterns. Independent experts working with the family are trying to determine whether standard tidal movement around Horn Island would actually produce that outcome, a body entering the water and surfacing 2 days later in essentially the same location, or whether that detail raises a separate, unresolved question about where Nolan actually entered the water in the first place. That analysis isn't finished, but it's now a formal part of the ongoing independent investigation. Step back and notice the pattern threading through all of this. The phone, both autopsies, the audio, the tidal science. Every single open question keeps circling back to that same 90-minute stretch, 3 o'clock to 4:31, and the only public account attempting to explain it comes from someone whose own words don't fully line up. We need to be genuinely fair to Warren Hudson here, one more time, because a documentary that only presents suspicion isn't honest reporting. Warren Hudson has not been charged with any crime. No law enforcement agency has publicly named him a suspect. His family has stated directly that nobody in their household is attempting to obstruct the investigation in any way, and that Warren has cooperated fully with the sheriff's office throughout this entire process. Everything we've walked through tonight could genuinely be nothing more than an honest memory error, the kind forensic psychology researchers have documented extensively. Compressed timelines, merged moments, emotional recall that sounds more visually precise than it actually is. That happens to completely truthful people constantly, particularly people speaking publicly about the worst day of their life, and there's no automatic reason to assume the darkest explanation from one inconsistency in one media interview. What we're saying, without exaggeration in either direction, is simply this: a real, documented gap exists in the public record right now. It's precisely the kind of gap a formal, individually conducted investigative interview is built to catch and close. If it eventually closes cleanly, that outcome matters and deserves to be reported with the same weight we've given the concerning version. If it doesn't close cleanly, that matters too. Neither outcome should be assumed before the facts arrive. It's worth naming honestly why this story became a national conversation in the first place, because it didn't happen in isolation. Nolan, who was black, traveled to an uninhabited barrier island with a group of high school friends who were mostly white, and he was the only one who never made it home. Threats against people connected to this case emerged alongside intense public speculation, fueled by genuine uncertainty about Nolan's final hours, long-standing public distrust of how cases like this get handled, and Mississippi's own documented history with racially motivated violence. Reverend Al Sharpton has said reward money would be administered through the National Action Network, and noted that filmmaker Tyler Perry offered support after being contacted about the case. Former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick personally funded an independent autopsy to help pursue a determination of Nolan's cause of death. This case is now headed toward a Mississippi grand jury, which will decide whether formal charges are warranted. Prosecutors have said the evidence will remain sealed from public view until the grand jury reviews it first, describing that decision as protective of the investigation's integrity rather than evasive. It's worth clarifying what a grand jury can actually consider, because the scope is broader than many people assume. It's not limited to homicide. It can weigh obstruction, evidence tampering, questions about withheld information, and any evidence relevant to how Nolan died. None of that means those specific things happened. It simply describes the categories a grand jury is structurally equipped to examine, entirely dependent on what evidence actually reaches it. It's equally worth clarifying what a grand jury referral doesn't mean, since online discussion has consistently inflated this. A grand jury review is not an indictment, not a formal charge, not a conclusion of any kind. It's a panel of ordinary citizens weighing evidence to determine whether probable cause exists for charges to move forward at all. 4 specific developments remain outstanding, ranked here by how significantly each could reshape public understanding of this case. The state's toxicology results and final autopsy findings sit at the top, since they represent the closest thing to objective physical evidence available, and whether they align with or contradict Mitchell's undetermined finding will matter enormously. Second, results from the joint phone inspection, evidence of deliberate deletion, would shift this case's entire shape, while a mundane technical explanation deserves equally serious reporting. Third, completed tidal analysis, a scientifically answerable question about whether Nolan's recovery location matches where he reportedly entered the water. Fourth, whatever the grand jury ultimately produces, sealed proceedings aside, an indictment against anyone for anything would be the closest thing to a definitive public answer this case is likely to generate anytime soon. None of these four have landed yet. If you want to know the moment any of them do, rather than catching a fragmented version through social media days later, subscribing is genuinely the most reliable way to stay current on a story that moves in unpredictable bursts, rather than a steady drip. More than 60 witnesses interviewed, FBI assistance on digital evidence, alongside a separate federal investigation into threats made against people connected to this case. A grand jury proceeding ahead. 2 autopsies, sealed, disagreeing with each other. A single phone under joint forensic review by both sides at once. An ocean engineer studying tidal drift near Horn Island. Somewhere inside all of it sits the answer Nolan's parents have been waiting for since the 4th of July. Here's what remains true and verifiable, stripped down completely. Warren Hudson said 2 things in one interview that cannot both be literally accurate: a 3 o'clock last sighting and a specific, detailed description of Nolan's exact position 90 minutes later. A trained analyst caught that gap. The person conducting the interview never asked the obvious follow-up question that would have resolved it. That question is still sitting there, publicly unanswered. Does that prove something happened to Nolan that nobody has admitted? We won't tell you that because we don't know, and nobody watching this video knows either. What we know is that a 90-minute window sits at the center of everything unresolved in this case, and the one account meant to explain it contains a gap almost everyone missed the first time through. If the last time you saw your best friend was 3 o'clock, how do you know exactly where he was sitting an hour and a half later? We'll keep following this until Nolan's family has an answer they can actually stand on. Tested and verified, not speculated. If you want to be here the moment that arrives, subscribing is the only way to make sure you're not finding out days after everyone else. So tell us, what single detail in this case stands out most to you? And what do you think investigators find when those sealed autopsy files finally open? We'll see you in the next one.